Did you know that somewhere inside the finished ZX Spectrum version of WEC Le Mans, there are a couple of lines of animation that survived being deleted as a bug? Well, I know that because I drew them, and someone else cleaned up my artwork without realising what they were looking at. If you've ever played WEC Le Mans or Bad Dudes vs Dragon Ninja on the ZX Spectrum, you've probably wondered how games like that actually got made back in the 1980s. So today I want to share a few stories from working on both games at Ocean Software, the kind of things you never saw in the magazines. One of the biggest advantages we had while making WEC Le Mans was that Ocean actually brought the arcade cabinet into the studio. Now, that might sound obvious today, but back then it was a huge luxury. The arcade machine was too big to fit inside our arcade alley at the back of the studio, so I had to sit in the middle of the room in front of the machine, sketching trees, road signs and roadside objects onto paper before walking back to my Atari ST and converting those rough drawings into ZX Spectrum graphics. You couldn't exactly call it glamorous. There was no digital screenshots, no asset packs, no internet. If you wanted to create the arcade game, you literally had to sit there and draw what you saw. Another big change for me was the upgrade of the hardware. Until this point in my career, most of my graphics work, particularly on Daley Thompson's Olympic Challenge, had been created using keyboard controls. WEC Le Mans was one of the first projects where I got to use a mouse. You'd think that would make life easier, but it didn't. I'd spent so long creating graphics with a keyboard that using a mouse actually felt awkward and alien to me. I remember thinking during the first day that I'd never get used to it. Of course now it seems ridiculous because we all use a mouse at some point without even thinking about it. But back then it genuinely felt like learning a completely new skill. Now, around that time I was also studying Warner Brothers animation, especially the work of Chuck Jones. One technique that fascinated me was the use of whiz lines, those little streaks that animators drew behind fast-moving objects to trick your brain into thinking you were seeing smoother movement. When I animated the cars spinning after a crash in WEC Le Mans, I borrowed exactly that idea. I didn't just copy the arcade animation, I added extra motion streaks and fragments from the previous frame to make the spin feel like it was spinning much smoother than the hardware could allow. When I watched the animation back, I thought it looked great, so I sent the graphics off to the programmers at Sentient Software. However, a few days later I was told that they'd found corruption in my sprite data. One of the artists had gone through and cleaned it all up for me. Except the corruption was my animation. Those extra lines I'd carefully added to smooth out the movement had been mistaken for mistakes and deleted. If you look closely at the finished game, I think a couple of those lines survived. They're still there today, quietly hiding in the animation. Another challenge was the sprite scaling. The ZX Spectrum had no hardware sprite scaling, so if you wanted objects to appear further away, somebody had to draw every size manually, and obviously that somebody was me. Every opponent's car existed in 5 or maybe 6 different sizes. Every roadside object had multiple versions as well: large, medium, small, smaller, tiny. Every single sprite was drawn by hand. The same applied to the trees, the signs, and scenery disappearing into the distance. People often forget just how much artwork went into creating the illusion of depth on machines like the Spectrum. After all the in-game graphics were completed, I had to create the loading screen. Problem was, there was no cover art, there was no promotional artwork, nothing. All I had was the game's logo from the arcade machine. So I basically invented the loading screen from scratch by imagining what a larger, more detailed version of the game might look like. It all had to be done in just a few days, so that's why it's not my best and looks a little bit rushed. The finished game also benefited from some serious programming work. As I remember it, Sentient Software produced the original engine, I think, and then Mike Lamb worked his magic and rewrote parts of it to make it much faster and much smoother. That combination helped make it one of the best looking racing games on the Spectrum. Shortly after that, I moved on to Bad Dudes vs Dragon Ninja. Once again, the arcade machine was sitting in Arcade Alley, so I spent a lot of time studying the characters. Sometimes I'd pause video recording, sometimes I'd sketch directly from the arcade screen. My job this time was creating all the character sprites and the animation, including the enemies and the end of level bosses. In some ways this was actually easier than my previous work. Like on Daley Thompson, I'd been trying to create smooth, realistic looking animation, but in Bad Dudes I already had great animation to copy from the arcade machine. That was surprisingly freeing because instead of wondering how something should move, I could concentrate on squeezing that movement into the ZX Spectrum's sprite sizes. Between these two games I also ended up doing something completely different. Ocean were producing demos of their games to go on magazine cover tapes, and obviously they needed loading screens for those. So Gary Bracey would appear in the morning asking for a loading screen for, let's say for example, Typhoon, and he would need it for the end of the day. So that was my work for the day. I probably created several cover tape loading screens, but that's the one I remember most because of how quickly it had to be done. There's another story connected with Bad Dudes that's followed me for a few years. Mark Jones always seemed convinced that while he was on holiday I'd created one of the game's backgrounds, but I kept telling him it wasn't me. Apart from anything else, he'd been using a background editor that I'd never even used before. There was no way I could have learnt a completely new tool and produced a finished level while he was away, but somebody did it. And we never found out who it was, but I can honestly say it wasn't me. When I finished the character graphics for Bad Dudes vs Dragon Ninja, I then moved over to work on my next game, which was Chase HQ. One thing I did enjoy doing was the loading screen, so while I was working on Chase HQ, Mark was working on the loading screen, which I kind of wanted to do myself because I like doing them so much, but he did a great job for it. Years later I finally created my own unofficial version simply because I had some free time and I'd always wanted to know what mine would have looked like if it had gone on the game. Looking back, Bad Dudes also taught me something else. When I worked on the Daley Thompson game, I barely challenged the programmers at all. I pretty much accepted every decision, so by the time I reached working on Bad Dudes vs Dragon Ninja, I'd swung too far the other way. In the Story of Ocean book, programmer Paul Owens remembers having an argument with me because I wanted certain animations like the jumps to be bigger and more dramatic than the hardware allowed. He joked that he was probably a bit of a nightmare to work with at the time, but I don't think so. I don't think that's quite how I'd describe it. I think I was overcorrecting. I'd gone from having almost no creative input to trying a little too hard to influence every animation. Thankfully I'd settled down a bit after that, and the later games became much more of a collaborative process. Looking back now, it's funny how many of these memories aren't about the finished games themselves. They're about sketching from arcade cabinets, learning to use a mouse for the first time, trying to sneak cartoon animation techniques into the sprites for a ZX Spectrum game, and watching your best ideas get deleted because someone else thought they were bugs. But those are the things that stay with you. Anyway, next time, the mighty Chase HQ on the ZX Spectrum and the Amstrad.